The auction block had been built from old fence posts and pine boards, thrown together quick, the way people throw together things they're ashamed of but intend to do anyway. It stood in the center of Blackthorn Valley's main street, just far enough from the general store that Mabel Price wouldn't have to look at it through her front window, though everyone knew she'd be watching from the side one. It was the kind of cold that didn't ask permission, the kind that came down from the mountains in November and didn't leave until it had taken something from you. A finger, a season, or your last remaining hope that people were mostly decent. The sky was the color of old pewter. The wind moved through the crowd and nobody moved back against it. They were too interested in what was happening on that platform to care about being cold. Evelyn Hart stood with her hands bound in front of her by a length of rough rope, not tight enough to cut, but tight enough to make a point, and she kept her eyes fixed on a spot just above the heads of the crowd. She'd learned that trick early. If you looked at their faces, you gave them something. You gave them the satisfaction of watching you flinch or cry or look away. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since the week after Thomas died, and she wasn't about to start again in the middle of Main Street with half the valley watching. She was 31 years old, and she felt 60. The man doing the bidding was Rupert Calloway, who served as Blackthorn Valley's unofficial magistrate in the way that small frontier towns often handed authority to whoever was loudest and least embarrassed by the sound of his own voice. He had a sheaf of papers in one gloved hand and a theatrical sense of ceremony that made Evelyn want to put her elbow through his teeth. "Evelyn Hart," he announced, like he was reading a livestock description. "Widow, age 31, no property, no kin willing to take responsibility. Skills include cooking, mending, basic farm labor." He paused. "Town council has determined that in the matter of outstanding debts owed by the late Thomas Hart to various creditors of this valley, the most practical solution—" "Just get on with it, Rupert," someone called from the crowd. A few people laughed. Calloway cleared his throat. "The most practical solution is an indenture arrangement. Successful bidder assumes responsibility for Mrs. Hart's debts and receives her labor in return for a period to be determined by how much." That was Ed Garner, who ran the tannery and whose idea of humor was to describe in detail the process by which animal hides were cured. He was looking at Evelyn with a kind of flat, assessing interest that made her skin crawl. "Bidding starts at $40, Calloway said. $40. Thomas's debts had come to just under $200. Whatever the successful bidder paid, Evelyn would owe the rest in labor, cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever they decided to call work, until the balance was cleared. It was dressed up in legal language, but everyone standing in that street understood what it was. 45, said Ed Garner. 50, said a man Evelyn didn't recognize, standing near the back with his hat pulled low. She kept her eyes above the crowd and thought about the summer she was 19, before she'd married Thomas, when she used to wake up early enough to see the mist still sitting on the river. And she'd believed, actually believed, the way you only can when you're young enough not to know better, that her life was going to be something worth telling. 55. 60. The bids moved the way interest always moved in Blackthorn Valley. Quick at first, then slower, then stopping altogether when the reality of what was being offered caught up with the enthusiasm of the moment. Because it wasn't just labor they'd be taking on, it was Evelyn Hart. And Evelyn Hart came with a history that the town had already decided was more trouble than it was worth. Thomas had been well liked, charming in the way that men who can't be trusted are often charming, easy with a laugh, loose with a promise, and very good at making his failures look like bad luck rather than bad choices. When he died 8 months ago, thrown from a horse he had no business riding drunk, the valley had mourned him with genuine feeling. And then the creditors had started arriving, and the picture of Thomas Hart had started looking considerably less flattering in the light of what he'd actually owed versus what he'd actually had. None of that was Evelyn's fault. She hadn't known about most of the debts. She hadn't signed most of the papers. But Thomas was dead, and someone had to be the face of his recklessness, and Evelyn was the one still standing, so she became it. The women in town were the worst, in some ways. Not cruel, exactly. Most of them were too careful for outright cruelty. But they had a way of removing themselves, of going quiet when she walked in, of finding somewhere else to be when she needed help. She understood it. She would have done the same thing once before she'd learned what it felt like to need something and have everyone decide they hadn't noticed. 65, said Ed Garner, getting back in. Any advance on 65? Calloway asked. Silence. 65 going once. Evelyn was still looking at the spot above the crowd's heads when she heard the boots. Not running. Nothing so urgent as that. Just walking with a kind of deliberate weight that made the frozen ground register each step. The crowd shifted. She heard people moving, heard the subtle change in the quality of the silence, the way a room goes quiet differently when it's empty versus when everyone in it has suddenly decided to stop talking. She let her eyes drop. The man walking toward the platform was not a man she'd expected to ever see on Main Street. She'd seen him twice in 4 years of living in the valley, once at the mill, once at the far end of the feed store. And both times he'd conducted his business with the focused efficiency of someone who considered every minute spent in town to be a minute stolen from somewhere more important. He was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not just in height, but in presence, as though he took up more space than his physical dimensions should have allowed. His coat was heavy canvas, work-worn and patched at one elbow. His jaw needed a razor. His dark eyes moved across the crowd with the patient, neutral assessment of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people were capable of. Gideon Wolfe. He ranched alone up in the high country, in a valley that most people in Blackthorn considered too remote and too cold to be worth the effort. He had no wife, no family that anyone knew of, and a reputation built almost entirely from the fact that he never started trouble, but had, on at least 3 well-documented occasions, finished it in ways that people still talked about with a careful combination of respect and wariness. He stopped at the foot of the platform and looked up at Evelyn. Just looked. Not the way Ed Garner had looked. Not with that flat inventory quality. Just looked. Like he was seeing her. Like she was actually a person standing on a wooden platform in the November cold. Then he looked at Rupert Calloway. "How much is owed total?" he said. His voice was low and even, and it carried in the cold air with no effort at all. Calloway blinked. The bidding is at 65. That's not what I asked. Total debt. What's the number? Calloway shuffled his papers with the nervous energy of a man who hadn't expected to be asked a direct question and wasn't sure he liked it. $182, he said, and change. Gideon Wolfe reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. He counted bills with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had earned every one of them. He held them out to Calloway. $200, he said. The extras for any fees you've buried in that paperwork. The crowd made a sound, not words, just a collective exhale of disbelief that briefly condensed in the cold air and disappeared. Ed Garner said, "Now wait just a—" "Bidding's over," Gideon said, without looking at him. He wasn't rude about it. He just stated it the way you state a fact. Calloway took the money with hands that weren't entirely steady. He said something about documentation and signatures, and Gideon said he'd sign whatever needed signing and Calloway could bring it to him. Then Gideon turned back to Evelyn. She was watching him with an expression she couldn't quite control. Not gratitude, not relief, not any of the emotions she supposed she should be feeling. Mostly, she felt a sharp, cold wariness, because she'd lived long enough to know that nobody spent $200 on a woman they didn't intend to own. He reached up and unwound the heavy canvas coat from his own shoulders. He stepped onto the platform's lower rung, it creaked under his weight, and settled the coat around her. It was warm from his body, and it smelled like pine resin and wood smoke and cold air, and it was by far the most unexpectedly human thing anyone had done for her in 8 months. He didn't say anything. He looked at the rope on her wrists, and something moved briefly across his face, displeasure, or something quieter than that. And he untied it with 3 efficient motions and let it drop. Then he stepped back down and said simply, "There's a wagon." But she didn't speak to him for the first mile. He didn't seem to require it. The wagon moved north out of Blackthorn, up the road that climbed toward the high country, and the town fell away behind them with a speed that Evelyn found disorienting after months of being unable to escape it. She sat on the bench beside him with his coat still around her shoulders, and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the pine trees thicken on either side of the road. Finally, she said, "What do you expect from me?" He kept his eyes on the road. "What I'd expect from anyone doing fair work." "That's not specific." "Cooking, mostly. Some mending, if you're willing. The cabin needs a second set of hands in winter." He paused. "I'm not a complicated man." She almost laughed at that, because she had significant doubts about whether it was true. No uncomplicated man drove into town and paid $200 for a woman everybody else had already decided wasn't worth $45. You spent more than you had to, she said. I spent what was owed. She looked at him. His profile was unreadable in the way that landscapes are unreadable, so you can see them clearly without knowing what they mean. Nobody thinks a woman whose husband ran up gambling debts and drank himself off a horse is worth $200. Then nobody was paying attention. She didn't know what to do with that, so she stopped talking. The ranch was not what she'd expected. She'd built up a picture in her mind during the ride, assembled from pieces of Gideon Wolfe's reputation, isolated, severe, functional to the point of bleakness. She'd expected something that looked like a man who'd decided comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. What she found instead was a cabin that was plain, certainly, but solidly built in a way that suggested its builder had cared about doing it right, even when no one was watching. The logs were fitted with precision. The roof had been recently repaired. There was a small covered porch with a bench on it, and a woodpile stacked with the particular neatness of someone who found satisfaction in order. A barn sat 20 yards back, and beyond it a fence line that ran along the base of the valley's northern ridge, with cattle moving slow and dark against the snow. She stood in the yard and looked at it, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. It looked like a place that meant something to someone. Your room's at the back, Gideon said from behind her. Small, but there's a stove. She turned around. My room. You'll want privacy. She had been prepared for so many things. She had prepared for cruelty, for possession, for the specific kind of entitlement that men who bought things sometimes confused with men who owned people. She had not prepared for a man who used the phrase, your room, like it was the obvious and natural thing to say. Gideon, Wolfe is fine, he said. Or Gideon, if you prefer. Either one. She studied him. Why did you do it? He was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the cattle moving along the fence line. The way men who aren't sure how to answer a direct question will often look at something they know better than themselves. Seemed wrong, he said finally. What they were doing, standing there watching it like it was nothing. Plenty of people thought it was wrong. They watched anyway. Shh. Yeah, he said. Turned back toward the cabin. Supper's late. There's salt pork in the cellar and dried beans. Make of that what you can. The first week was strange in the way that new silences are strange, weighted with all the things that haven't been said yet. Evelyn moved through the cabin with the careful deference of someone who expected at any moment to be told she'd done something wrong. And Gideon moved through it with the self-contained efficiency of a man who'd lived alone for so long that he'd stopped noticing the gaps where another person might go. They ate dinner across from each other the first night with almost no words between them. The salt pork she'd made into something halfway decent with the dried beans and the last of a jar of preserved tomatoes she'd found in the back of a cabinet. He ate all of it. He said it was good. She said it wasn't, but the ingredients were limited. He said fair enough. The second night she made cornbread and he ate 3 pieces and didn't comment at all, which she decided to take as a compliment. On the third day, she found him behind the barn in the pale morning light, mending a section of fence with the focused attention of a man who considered every cracked board a personal failing. She stood and watched him work for a moment. His hands were capable and sure, and he did it without wasted motion. I can help, she said. He looked up. He seemed to be considering whether to argue about it. Know how to use a hammer? My father built houses, she said. I know how to use a hammer. He handed her one. They worked side by side for 2 hours without talking much, and it was the most comfortable she'd felt in longer than she could clearly remember. There was something about useful work, honest, physical, purposeful, that untangled things in her chest that had been knotted for months. She hammered and he held the boards level, and the fence got mended, and that was that. And at the end of it, he handed her a cup of coffee from the pot he'd brought from the cabin, and she drank it in the cold air, and thought that this was very strange, and possibly the least awful she'd felt in a year. The trouble with Blackthorn Valley was that it was small enough that the 20 miles between Gideon's ranch and the town's main street might as well have been 20 feet when it came to the efficient travel of information. By the end of the first week, people had opinions. By the end of the second, those opinions had become stories. Harriet Dunn, whose particular gift was phrasing malice as concern, told anyone who'd listen that poor Gideon Wolfe had clearly been taken in by a woman with nothing to lose, and therefore nothing to stop her from doing as she pleased. Old Pete Sallow at the feed store said he gave it a month before Evelyn Hart had run through whatever patience that man had and found herself back on the road. The Calloway sisters agreed that it was a kindness, what Gideon had done, but a misguided one. You couldn't take on another person's bad reputation and come out clean on the other side. Evelyn heard most of this on the first Saturday she went to town with Gideon to collect supplies. She heard it in the way women hear things said about them, not directly, but in the shift of conversations, the deliberate glances, the kind of calculated, not quite loud enough comments that are designed to land exactly where they're aimed. She bought flour and coffee and a bolt of wool fabric for mending, and she kept her face neutral throughout, because she had practice at that. And she was damned if she was going to give Harriet Dunn the satisfaction of a reaction. On the ride back, she was quiet in a way that Gideon apparently noticed, because after about 3 miles, he said without preamble, "What did they say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before." "That doesn't mean it didn't land." She looked out at the trees going by. "Harriet Dunn thinks you're being naive." Harriet Dunn thought her prize bull was going to win the county fair 3 years running, and he never placed once. He paused. "Her judgment isn't reliable." Despite herself, Evelyn almost smiled. The hardest part was the nights, not because Gideon was anything other than what he'd presented himself to be. There were no unwelcome footsteps, no hands where they shouldn't be, none of the specific violations she'd steeled herself for in the first days. She'd bolted her door that first night from habit, and when she'd come out in the morning, she could tell from nothing, from absolute nothing, that he'd noticed or cared. The hardest part was the quiet in her own head. She lay in the small back room with the wood stove throwing heat, and she listened to the wind off the mountains, and she thought about who she'd been before Thomas, before the debts and the death and the standing on a wooden platform with her wrists tied. And she couldn't quite make the two versions of herself connect. The 19-year-old who'd believed her life was going to mean something, and the 31-year-old in a borrowed room in a stranger's house with exactly $3 to her name and a reputation that preceded her like a bad smell. She was not a woman who cried easily. She'd trained herself out of it years ago when she'd realized that crying around Thomas only made things worse, only gave him something to dismiss or use. But alone in the dark, she let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her. Not just the house and the money and the standing, but the version of herself that had believed in her own future. And then, because she had never been very good at feeling sorry for herself for long, she rolled over and thought about what needed doing tomorrow. 3 weeks after she arrived, she found Gideon sitting at the table after dinner with a ledger open in front of him and the particular expression of a man who is looking at numbers that aren't adding up the way he'd like. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing that needs fixing tonight." "The fence line to the south," she said, "the one by the creek. A section of it's down. I saw it yesterday when I went to check the water." He looked up. "I didn't say anything because I thought you probably knew already," she said. "But if the cattle get through that gap before snow covers the lower pasture, they'll drift toward the Cutter property," he said. "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know about the fence, haven't had time." "I can do it," she said. "It's a 2-person job." "Then we'll do it together." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was still learning to read. Not exactly surprise, not exactly something warmer than that, somewhere in the narrow space between them. "Tomorrow," he said. "Early." "Early's fine," she said. "I'm a poor sleeper anyway." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. The fence they fixed. The cattle stayed in. The first snow of what would prove to be a long winter came down thick and early that week, settling over the valley like something final. And for a few days, Evelyn and Gideon were largely confined to the cabin and the barn by weather that made the quarter-mile between them feel like a considerable achievement. She found, to her genuine surprise, that the confinement wasn't miserable. He wasn't a man who demanded entertainment or attention. He read, when the light was good, newspapers months old that he'd collected in town, a battered history of the territory, a copy of Shakespeare's plays that she asked about, and he said had been his mother's. He mended tack and she mended clothing, and they shared the table, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and neither absence nor presence of conversation felt like failure. One evening, the fire going, the wind doing its business outside, she asked him how long he'd been on the ranch alone. He was quiet for a moment. 7 years. By choice? He thought about that. At first, no, he said. Then yes. Then I stopped keeping track of which it was. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. What happened? She asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then, I had a partner, early on. Another man, name of Cole Rathbone. We built the first part of the cabin together, thought we'd build something worth building. He set down the piece of harness he'd been working on. He decided there was easier money down south. Just decided. Left me a note and his half of the flour, and that was that. Evelyn didn't say she was sorry, because she'd come to think that sorry was often a word people used when they didn't want to sit with something for long enough to feel it. Instead, she said, "Did you look for him?" "No." A pause. Some things, once they're gone, you have to let them stay gone. She thought about Thomas, about the man she'd believed she was marrying versus the man who had actually been there all along. "Yes," she said. "I know what you mean." The fire popped. Outside, the snow made the world very white and very quiet. It was, she thought, the strangest version of peace she'd ever felt. Incomplete, uncertain, fragile as anything in a hard winter, but real, the way things are only real when they cost something. She wasn't ready to call it safety, but she was beginning to think she might, eventually, call it something. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week, she came out of her room to find Gideon at the stove already. Coffee made, 2 cups on the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a production of it. He just made 2 cups. She sat down and picked one up. "Thank you," she said. "Coffee's better when you're not drinking it alone," he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it move through her fingers, and she thought this. This is what it looks like when someone sees you. Not the person they need you to be, not the version that fits their idea of things. Just you, with your complicated history and your guarded expressions and your $3 in your mother's hands that were built for harder work than Blackthorn Valley had ever given her credit for. She thought about the platform, the rope, the crowd. She thought about the coat that had smelled like pine resin and wood smoke. She drank her coffee and watched the snow through the window, and she did not cry because she didn't need to. There was something growing in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't hope exactly, but was something between them. The tentative, terrifying beginning of believing that she might, against all evidence, have landed somewhere she was allowed to be. She wasn't grateful the way a rescued thing is grateful. She was something harder and quieter than that. She was beginning to consider the possibility of staying. The coffee became a ritual without either of them deciding it would. Every morning, Gideon was up first. She never once beat him to the stove, though she tried a few times out of some stubborn instinct she couldn't quite name. And every morning there were 2 cups on the table when she came out. He never commented on it. She never thanked him more than once. It simply became the shape of their mornings, the way certain things become shapes without you ever sitting down and agreeing to them. December settled over the valley hard and early. The snow that had come in November hadn't left, and new snow kept arriving to pile on top of it until the world outside the cabin windows looked less like a landscape and more like something the mountains were slowly burying. The cattle required more work in deep cold, extra feed hauled out twice a day, water troughs broken open every morning where they froze overnight, fences checked after every storm for boards blown loose or snow weight collapse. Gideon moved through all of it with the steady, unhurried competence of a man who had wintered in this valley enough times to stop being surprised by it. Evelyn moved through it with him. She hadn't planned to make herself useful in the way she did. She'd expected to cook and mend and keep to herself and let him conduct his ranch the way he'd conducted it before she arrived. But the work was there and her hands were capable, and sitting inside watching someone else labor in the cold went against something fundamental in her nature. So she pulled on the extra coat Gideon had produced from a trunk without comment one morning and went out with him, and that was that. He didn't make a fuss over it. He didn't tell her she didn't have to or ask if she was sure. He just showed her which bucket was for the east trough and which was for the west, and trusted her to get it right, and she did. There was a specific satisfaction in that trust. Small and unannounced, and nothing like the grand gestures people wrote about in the kind of stories she'd read as a girl. Just a man who handed you a bucket and assumed you'd fill it right. Thomas had never done that. Thomas had needed her to be less capable than him, in the way that certain men need that particular arrangement to feel steady in themselves. Any competence she'd shown had always had to be carefully managed, offered sideways, never directly, or it would curdle into something that required an apology from her later. She thought about Thomas less and less. When she caught herself thinking about him now, it was mostly with a tired kind of assessment, the way you assess a bad winter or a failed crop. What went wrong, what she should have seen sooner, what she would do differently. Less grief than accounting. That probably said something about her. She wasn't entirely sure what. One afternoon, in the second week of December, she was in the barn working through a pile of mending. Two of Gideon's work shirts had seams that had given out, and there was a horse blanket that needed a patch before it became useless. When she heard boots on the barn floor and looked up to find Gideon carrying a lantern and a troubled expression. "Heifer in the north pasture," he said. "She's trying to calve. Shouldn't be. She's too early. But she's trying." Evelyn set down her mending. "What do you need?" "Second pair of hands if it goes badly." He paused. "It might go badly." "Then let's go." It went badly. Not catastrophically. The calf survived, which was what mattered. But it was 2 hours in the bitter cold, and it was not graceful work. And at one point, Evelyn was kneeling in the snow with her arms in places she'd rather not describe, while Gideon talked the heifer through it with a low, steady patience that she found unexpectedly moving. He talked to the animal the way some people only ever talk to other people, quite careful, calm, present. The calf came out small and stupid-eyed and perfect, and the heifer turned around and started cleaning it with a focus that suggested she'd already forgotten the last 2 hours entirely. "Does she do that every time?" Evelyn asked, sitting back on her heels in the snow. She was cold and filthy, and her arms were shaking with a combination of cold and effort. "Pretty much," Gideon said. He was crouched beside her, watching the heifer and calf with an expression of mild relief. "Animals are practical. Once it's done, it's done." "I envy that sometimes," she said. He looked at her. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Me too." They walked back to the cabin in the dark, and she made coffee because it was that kind of night, and they sat at the table and drank it without talking for a while, and it was fine. It was better than fine. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought, with something like wonder, that she had not felt afraid today. Not once. Not a flicker of it. She couldn't remember the last time that had been true. The town came back for her, as she'd known it would. It came in the form of a woman named Clara Holt, who arrived one Saturday morning on a horse she had no business riding in that weather, with the specific determined energy of someone who has given themselves a mission they intend to see through. Clara was not a bad woman. Evelyn had never thought she was a bad woman. She was 40, practical, the kind of person who organized things and made sure they got done. And she had been one of the few in Blackthorn who had offered Evelyn a kind word in the months after Thomas died, which was why what she said stung the way it did. Gideon had gone to the back pasture when Clara rode in, so it was Evelyn who let her in and put coffee on and sat across from her at the kitchen table while Clara took off her gloves with the slow deliberateness of someone preparing what she wants to say. "I came because I was worried," Clara said. "About you." "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "You look fine." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "That's not what I mean." She looked up. "People are talking, Evelyn. People were talking before I left town. I don't expect they've stopped. They're saying—" Clara paused, recalibrated. "There are people saying that Gideon Wolfe that the arrangement isn't what he said it was." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What are they saying the arrangement is?" Clara had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You know how people are." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I do. What specifically are they saying?" "That you're living here as his—" Clara stopped again. She set down the cup. "Harriet Dunn is saying you went willingly, that there was something between you and Gideon before Thomas died." The cold settled into the room. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "There wasn't," Evelyn said. I know that. Do you? Because you came all the way out here in December snow, which suggests maybe you weren't entirely sure. Claire's jaw tightened. I came because I'm your friend. You were my friend, Evelyn said, and her voice was level and quiet. When it was easy. When Thomas was alive and there was nothing to be lost by it. After he died, I didn't see you for 3 weeks. She picked up her coffee. I'm not angry about it. I understand how it works. But don't come out here and call yourself my friend and then tell me the town's stories like you think I need to account for myself. Clara was quiet. She had the look of a woman who had expected a different conversation and wasn't sure how to proceed with this one. They won't leave it alone, she said finally. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Whatever Gideon's intentions are, good, bad, whatever, the talk is going to follow you, and it's going to follow him. She looked at her hands. Some of the men on the Valley Council are saying his grazing rights renewal is coming up, that there might be questions asked. That was new? Evelyn set down her cup. They'd go after his land rights. I'm not saying they would. I'm saying, you're saying the town will punish him for what he did because it makes them look bad, Evelyn said. Because when a man pays $200 for a woman everyone's already decided is worthless, it makes every person who stood there and watched look like what they are. Clara didn't answer that. She finished her coffee and put her gloves back on and said she hoped Evelyn would be careful, and she rode back toward town in the snow, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched her go with a feeling in her chest that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, something that lived between them, something tired and old. Gideon came back an hour later and found her at the table still, the coffee gone cold in front of her. Who was here? He said. Clara Holt. She looked up. She came to warn me. The Valley Council might make trouble for your grazing rights because of me being here. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything immediately, just drank the coffee and looked at the table. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For bringing this to your door. You paid my debts and took me in, and now they're going after your land. They haven't gone after anything yet, he said. Gideon, Rupert Calloway has been looking for a reason to argue about my north boundary for 2 years, he said. This isn't about you. You're just the excuse that's convenient right now. He looked up. Don't take that on. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very unbothered by things that should bother you. I didn't say it doesn't bother me, he said. I said it's not your fault. She looked back at the table. I keep thinking, she said slowly, that I'm making your life harder, that you were fine here before, quiet, settled, and now there's all of this. Was I fine? He said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked up. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands. 7 years is a long time to have nobody around who'll tell you when a fence board is loose, he said, or split the work on a calving night. He set the cup down. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't... He stopped. I was getting through. That's not the same as fine. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, and he didn't seem to need her to. Christmas came and went quietly. They didn't make much of it. Evelyn made a decent pie from canned apples, and Gideon produced a bottle of whiskey he'd apparently been saving for an occasion, and they sat by the fire and drank 1 glass each and talked for a while longer than usual. He told her about a winter when he was a boy, when the snow had come up to the eaves of his father's house and they'd had to tunnel out to reach the barn. She told him about the summer she was 15 and had snuck out of her parents' house 3 nights running to sit by the river alone, because she'd wanted to know what it felt like to be somewhere that didn't have expectations attached to it. Did it work? He asked. For about an hour each time, she said. Then I started thinking about all the things I was supposed to be doing, and it stopped working. He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. It was the most comfortable she had ever been in a room with another person, and she recognized that fact with the careful, slightly suspicious attention of someone who has learned not to trust comfortable things. January came in with a ferocity that made December look polite. Temperatures dropped to the kind of numbers that made the air hurt to breathe, and for a stretch of 2 weeks the world outside reduced to the barn and back, the cattle and the stoves, the work of keeping living things warm and fed. They fell into a rhythm that had nothing deliberate about it and everything necessary. She took the east side of the barn, he took the west. They met in the middle. They went back inside, they ate, they slept, they did it again. She was stronger than she'd been in November. She could feel it. In her arms when she lifted the feed buckets, in her hands that had toughened past the blister stage, in the way she woke up tired but not broken. The work was doing something to her that she hadn't expected. It was reassembling something. Then Nora Price came to the ranch with a basket of preserves and a mouthful of information she couldn't wait to deliver. Nora was Mabel Price's youngest daughter, and she had inherited her mother's conviction that caring about other people's business was a form of civic virtue. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late January with the basket over one arm and a bright, slightly too interested smile, and she looked around the cabin with the careful inventory of someone cataloging everything she intended to report back. "Just wanted to check in," Nora said, setting the basket on the table. "Mama's been worried." "Your mother doesn't know me well enough to worry about me," Evelyn said pleasantly. "She worries in a general way." Nora's eyes moved to the 2 coffee cups on the shelf, the mended shirts hanging near the door, the particular lived-in quality of a space that 2 people were occupying. "It's a nice place," she said. "Cozy." "It's functional," Evelyn said. "Mr. Wolfe must be glad of the company." A pause. Calculated. Just a half beat longer than it should have been. "It must be lonely up here otherwise." "I wouldn't know how it was before," Evelyn said. "I wasn't here." Nora smiled with all her teeth. She accepted the cup of coffee Evelyn poured her because refusing it would have forced a different kind of conversation, and she sat down and she talked about the town with the inexhaustible detailed interest of someone who had made it her life's work. And Evelyn sat across from her and listened and gathered, the way you gather things when you know information is power and you've been operating without it. What she gathered was this. Harriet Dunn had gotten louder. The stories about Evelyn had moved from the vague and insinuating to the specific and ugly, things that weren't true, dressed up with just enough plausibility that people who wanted to believe them could. There was a faction of the Valley Council, apparently, that had decided Gideon's ranch would be considerably more useful as additional grazing land for Ed Garner's expanding operation if Gideon could be pressured into letting his boundary dispute drag on until he defaulted on his claim fees. And Evelyn's presence, the talk around it, the suggestion of impropriety, was the lever they intended to use to make that pressure feel justified. After Nora left, with nothing she hadn't brought, Evelyn made certain of that. Evelyn sat at the table and felt something sharpen in her chest. Not fear. She'd burned through her supply of fear somewhere around the 2nd week here. What she felt was something colder and more specific. She understood now what she was. Not to Gideon. She was beginning, tentatively, to understand what she was to Gideon. But to the town, to Calloway and Garner and the rest of them, she was a useful problem, something that could be pointed at. As long as she was here, she was ammunition. She could leave. That was the obvious solution. If she went, took herself and the talk and the ammunition with her, but maybe Gideon's claim fees got paid, and his grazing rights renewed and his quiet life returned to the state it had been in before he'd made the mistake of doing something decent in public. She sat with that for 3 days. She sat with it through the morning coffees and the evening work and the meals they shared across from each other while the cold pressed against the windows. She sat with it through a night when she couldn't sleep, and she lay in her room listening to the wind and building the argument in her head until it was solid and logical and pointed entirely in one direction. On the 4th morning, she came out of her room with her bag. Gideon was at the table with his coffee. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who has been waiting for a thing he hoped wouldn't come. "I'm making it worse," she said. "Being here. They're going to use me to go after your land rights, and I won't—" "Evelyn, let me finish." She set the bag down. "You've been decent to me. More than decent. And I won't repay that by staying and watching them take your land because you had the bad luck to do the right thing where people could see you." She looked at him directly. "It makes sense for me to go." He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Where?" he asked. She hadn't thought that far. "I'll find something. There's work in winter." He said it flat. Not accusatory, just a statement of fact about the world they were both living in. In a territory where every town between here and the next county has heard your name by now and has an opinion about it. He set the cup down. "You'd be back on a platform inside a month." "I can take care of myself." "I know you can." He looked up. "That's not the point." Then what is the point? He was quiet again. He was a man who chose his words with the same care he chose his lumber. He wanted them to hold weight without splitting. I didn't bring you here because I needed someone to cook, he said, or mend shirts or haul water. He looked at the table, then back at her. The work's real, but that's not why. She waited. I watched them stand in that street, he said. All those people who'd known you and eaten at your table and borrowed your husband's tools, standing there, watching you get sold off like you were inventory. And I thought, he stopped, tried again. I thought about what it would mean to walk away and have that be the thing I did. The thing I let happen because it wasn't my business. Gideon, I didn't do it for pity, he said, and his voice had an edge that wasn't anger but was related to it. I want to be clear about that. I've never once looked at you with pity. You came here and you worked and you figured things out and you didn't ask for anything you hadn't earned. He looked at her steadily. You're not a burden. You're the least burden anyone's been to me in 7 years. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected something kinder but less specific, something that could be received gracefully and stored at a distance. This landed differently. The grazing rights, she started, are my problem, he said, not yours. He pushed back from the table and stood up, because he was a man who could only stay still for so long when things mattered. He went to the window and looked out at the snow. A real home isn't the place where pain disappears, he said. To the window, to the winter, to somewhere out past both. It's the place where pain is allowed to stay and heal. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, which carried 7 years of alone in them, shaped by it, worked hard against it. Not broken, but not unbothered either. That's the thing you need to understand, he said, turning around. This place isn't perfect. I'm not perfect. The town's going to do what the town does. But you've got the right to stay somewhere you've earned a place. His jaw tightened slightly. And you've earned a place here. She stood in the kitchen with her bag at her feet, and she felt every version of herself she'd ever been standing in that room with her simultaneously. The girl by the river, the woman who'd married Thomas, the person on the platform, and this one, here, now, with cold fingers and strong arms, and the specific ache of someone who has been offered something real and doesn't know if she's still capable of accepting it. The bag stayed on the floor. She sat back down at the table. She picked up her coffee. She wrapped her hands around it and let the warmth move through her fingers. And she looked out the window at the white and relentless winter and she said, The east trough was freezing faster than the west one yesterday. The sun angle's wrong on that side. He was quiet for a second. Then, I know. I've been thinking about moving it 6 feet. That might do it, she said. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the snow kept its silence. She had said she was staying without saying the words, and he had heard it without asking her to say them. And that was exactly the right way for it to happen between two people who had both learned the hard way that words are often the last thing that gets said and not the first. The bag stayed on the floor all day. That evening she unpacked it and put things back where they belonged, and Gideon didn't comment on it, and she didn't explain it, and neither of them needed to. Winter pressed on. They pressed back. The days grew gradually, almost imperceptibly longer, which in deep January feels less like a promise and more like a rumor. Something you've heard but can't confirm yet. Something that requires a certain stubborn willingness to believe in before there's real evidence for it. Evelyn chose to believe in it. That was not a small thing. For her, at that point in her life, with everything that had been taken and everything that had been said and all the ways she had been told, directly and indirectly, that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. Choosing to believe in something that wasn't proven yet was the most significant act of courage she had committed in years. She did it quietly, the way she did most things, without announcement, without asking for credit. The coffee kept getting made. The stove kept getting lit. The cattle kept getting fed in the cold and the dark, and the fence lines kept getting checked, and the evenings kept coming, firelit and unhurried. And the winter kept doing its slow, grinding work on the world outside while something else entirely was doing its work on the world inside those 4 walls. February came in like something that had decided to prove a point. The storms that month were different from January's, less about sustained cold and more about violence, sudden and sharp, blowing down from the northern ridge with a speed that caught you wrong if you weren't paying attention. Gideon had lost a section of the south fence to a windstorm in the first week, and they'd spent 3 days in deteriorating weather repairing it, working in shifts because you couldn't keep your hands useful for more than an hour at a stretch before the cold turned them clumsy. Evelyn had developed a system. Gloves off for the precise work, gloves back on the moment precision wasn't required. Stamp your feet every few minutes, whether you think you need to or not. Gideon had watched her figure this out on the first day and said nothing, which was his way of approving it. By the middle of February, she could read him with a reliability that still surprised her sometimes. The way his jaw set when he was working through a problem versus when he was actually angry. The specific silence he used when he disagreed with something, but had decided it wasn't worth the argument versus the silence that meant he was listening harder than he looked. The way he moved through the barn with his cattle, not soft exactly, but steady, the kind of presence that animals settled around rather than shied from. She told herself periodically not to learn him too well, not to let the reading of him become something she needed. She'd said that to herself with the same sensible, practical voice she used for things like checking the water troughs before the temperature dropped and keeping an extra week of flour in reserve. It was the right thing to do. She said it. She kept learning him anyway. The thing between them had changed since the morning she'd picked up her bag. Neither of them had named it, and she suspected neither of them would. They were both constitutionally unsuited to naming things before they were sure of them, which meant they were living inside something that had no official title and considerable weight. He stood closer than he used to, not intrusively, just closer. Like the 3 feet of deliberate distance he'd maintained in November had quietly become 2 feet and then 18 inches without anyone deciding it should. She'd caught herself noticing where he was in a room the way you notice weather, not obsessively, just as a matter of ongoing awareness, because it mattered. She'd also caught herself smiling at things he said when his back was turned, which she considered a development she could have done without. It was on a Thursday in the last week of February, with the sky doing something complicated and gray above the ridge, that she was at the cabin window watching Gideon come back from the barn and saw the rider coming down the north road behind him. Not a familiar horse, not anyone from the valley, based on the animal's gait and the way it was ridden. Too upright, too deliberate. Someone who rode for impression rather than efficiency. She watched the rider pull up at the fence line and say something to Gideon, and she watched Gideon go still in the way he went still when something required his complete attention. She had the door open before either of them reached the cabin. The man who came through the gate with Gideon was somewhere between 40 and 50, lean in the way of men who stay lean through will rather than circumstance, with a face that wore its charm like a coat it could take off whenever it was no longer needed. He was well dressed for the territory, not frontier practical, but made for being looked at. The kind of clothes that said money in a place where money usually said boots that fit, and not much else. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and pale eyes that did a quick, thorough inventory of Evelyn the moment he saw her, the kind of look that gathered information and filed it immediately. She knew him. The knowing landed in her stomach like cold water. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was warm in the way that fireplaces in houses you don't own are warm. "You look well." "Silas," she said. Silas Mercer. Thomas's cousin by marriage, technically, though the connection had always felt deliberately vague whenever it suited him to be vague about it. He'd been at the edges of her life with Thomas, showing up at particular moments, always with that quality of having arrived with an agenda he wasn't disclosing, always leaving with something he hadn't had when he came. She'd never trusted him, and she'd never had the specific evidence to explain why, which was one of the more frustrating varieties of being right about a person. "Mr. Wolf," Silas said, turning to Gideon with his hand extended. "I appreciate you letting me come in out of the cold. The ride from Blackthorn in this weather is no small thing." Gideon shook his hand with the flat, minimum courtesy of a man doing the polite thing without any warmth behind it. "You've got business here." "I do." Silas sat down at the table without being invited, which was either confidence or rudeness depending on how charitable you were feeling, and Evelyn was feeling neither. "Coffee would be welcome if it's not any trouble." She didn't move toward the stove. Silas looked at her. He adjusted something in his expression, recalibrated for her not being the person he'd expected, or the person she used to be. "I've come about the matter of Thomas's estate," he said. "What remains of it?" "There's nothing remaining," Evelyn said. "The debts were paid." "The debts to local creditors, yes." He reached into his coat and produced papers. There were always papers with men like Silas, documents that looked official enough at a distance that people didn't look closer. There are outstanding obligations that weren't included in the Valley Council's accounting. Thomas had dealings with parties outside this territory that predate some of the local arrangements. What kind of dealings? Gideon said. He was standing near the door with his arms at his sides, and he was watching Silas with the flat, patient attention of a man who has decided to let someone talk until they get to the real thing they came to say. Business dealings, Silas said. He turned back to Evelyn. The short of it is that certain parties have a legitimate claim on assets that were Thomas's, and by extension, as his widow, that puts you in a position where— Where what? Evelyn said. He spread his hands in a gesture of apology he didn't mean. Where the most practical resolution would be for you to come back, to settle matters in person with the parties involved. He paused. I have authority to escort you. The room was very quiet. You have authority? Evelyn said. Legal authority? There are documents. Let me see them, Gideon said. Silas looked at him with the particular assessment of a man who has walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found another. These are matters between family members. She's in my house, Gideon said. Let me see the documents. There was a beat, short, but there, where Silas decided something. He handed the papers across. Gideon took them to the window where the light was better. He read them with the slow, thorough attention of someone who had learned not to trust words arranged in official-looking ways. Evelyn watched his face. She saw the moment something registered, a slight tightening around his eyes, the kind of tell you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. These are debt collection documents, Gideon said, signed by a magistrate in Fort Carver. He looked up. Fort Carver's 4 days south of here. You rode 4 days in February to collect on a debt that's— He checked the paper. $60. Silas smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. It's the principle of the thing. What's the actual thing? Evelyn said. Evelyn. He looked at her. The charm coat came off. Thomas owed money to men who don't wait politely, he said. And those men have decided that since Thomas is unavailable, his widow is the next available asset. Now, he held up a hand before she could speak. I am trying to help you. I am the buffer between you and men who would be considerably less pleasant about this conversation. I'm offering you a way to settle this quietly, and what? She said. Go where? To do what? There are arrangements that can be made. I have connections in the Southern Territory. What kind of arrangements? Her voice was flat and cold. His jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to being interrupted. The kind that solve your problem. The kind where I'm indebted to you instead of someone else, she said. The kind where I trade one set of papers for another and somehow the person I end up owing is you. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in him. Not anger exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who has underestimated something and is taking inventory of the damage. You've changed, he said. Yes, she said. I have. He turned to Gideon, man to man now, which was a strategy she recognized and which made her tired in a bone-deep way. I don't know what she's told you about her situation, but the truth of it is that Evelyn has obligations she hasn't been honest about with you. You've been generous. No one's disputing that. But you've taken on a problem you don't fully understand. I understand it fine, Gideon said. The men Thomas owed aren't in this room, Gideon said. You are. And you've got documents from a magistrate 4 days away, which tells me this visit isn't official business. It's personal business dressed up in official clothes. He folded the papers and held them out. I think you should go. Silas didn't take the papers immediately. He let the moment sit, testing it. The way men who are used to getting what they want will test the thing that's blocking them to see if it moves. It didn't move. He took the papers. He stood up. He put them back in his coat, and he looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man filing something away for later. Think about it, he said to her. That's all I'm asking. Think about what you're doing and who you're trusting and whether the arrangement you've got here is as solid as it looks. He looked around the cabin with deliberate assessment. Winter doesn't last forever. Things look different in the spring. Get out, Gideon said. Quiet. Final. Silas went. They heard his horse on the frozen ground, the sound of it diminishing toward the north road, and then gone. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and breathed. Are there actually men Thomas owed? Gideon asked. Probably, she said. Thomas owed everyone eventually. Whether Silas is connected to them, or whether he's inventing a connection because it's useful, she stopped. I don't know. I never knew what was true with Thomas's business. I only found out about most of it when the creditors started arriving. If there are real debts, I'm not going with him, she said. Whatever the debt is, I'm not going with him. Gideon looked at her. I didn't ask you to. I know. She let out a long breath. I just wanted to be clear about that. Evelyn. He waited until she looked at him. I know. She nodded. She went and poured herself the coffee she'd declined to make for Silas, and she sat down at the table and held the cup and tried to steady the thing in her chest that Silas's visit had knocked loose. The problem was not the debt. She'd lived with debt's shadow for the better part of a year and had learned its specific weight. The problem was Silas himself, the fact of him arriving here, finding her. The fact that the world she'd been trying to put behind her knew where she was. Touch. Silas came back 4 days later. This time he came with company. 2 men rode with him, not the kind of men who had any interest in looking official. They had the specific quality of men hired for their size and their willingness not to ask too many questions, and they positioned themselves at the fence line with the theatrical patience of a stage prop while Silas came to the door alone. Evelyn saw them from the barn, where she'd been working when they rode in. She came to the barn door and stood there and watched Silas cross the yard to the cabin and knock, which told her Gideon was inside. She went back to what she was doing. She needed a minute to think without anyone watching her think. Silas had not come 4 days from Fort Carver twice in February for $60. She'd known that the first time, and she knew it now with the additional confirmation of the 2 men at the fence line. The debt documents were real enough, probably. Silas was too careful to travel without something that could be waived at a magistrate. But the documents were a frame, not the picture. The picture was something else. She thought about what she knew. Thomas had been charming and unreliable and had a gift for finding people who would lend him money on the strength of his personality. Silas had been at the edges of that world. Not a friend, exactly, but a presence. Someone who benefited from being proximate to Thomas without being directly accountable for him. What did Silas actually want? She looked at the barn around her. The solid, well-fitted boards. The horses standing quiet in their stalls. The particular earned quality of everything here that had been built by a man who believed in doing things right. She thought about Gideon's grazing rights and the Valley Council and Ed Garner's expanding operation, and something connected in her mind with a click that felt like a key in a lock. She walked across the yard and into the cabin. Gideon was at the table with the documents spread out in front of him again. Silas was standing near the window, doing the version of himself that was reasonable and patient and had come a long way in bad weather and just wanted to resolve things amicably. If she simply acknowledges the debt and agrees to an arrangement, we can handle the rest through the appropriate channels, Silas was saying. What's the land? Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. The documents, she said, walking to the table. She picked up the papers and found the one she'd only half read the first time. A survey attachment, smaller print, tucked behind the main document. This surveys the north boundary of a parcel. She looked up at Silas. That's this ranch. Silas said nothing. Thomas never had anything to do with this land, she said. We never owned land up here. We never had any dealings with anyone in this part of the territory. She set the paper down. So why is a survey of Gideon's north boundary attached to a debt document with Thomas's name on it? Gideon picked up the survey and looked at it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes went very quiet and very specific. Where did this survey come from? He said. It's a county document, Silas started. Who commissioned it? Gideon said. Silas recalibrated again. He was good at it, she'd give him that. He had the flexibility of a man who had talked his way through many rooms and always had another approach ready. The county surveyor's office conducts routine. Ed Garner commissioned it, Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Silas's face told her Gideon was right before Silas said a single word. This was never about Thomas's debt, Evelyn said. She looked at Silas with a clarity that felt almost like relief. The specific relief of understanding a bad thing completely rather than fearing it half blind. You came here because someone told you that if you could get me to leave, or better, to sign something acknowledging a debt that gives Garner's people a foothold on this property, then the whole problem of Gideon's grazing rights and his north boundary becomes much simpler. Silas looked at her. The charm coat was fully off now. What was underneath it was not quite hostile, but it was not friendly. It was the look of a man assessing how much of a problem she'd become. "You're not as stupid as Thomas always said," he said. "Thomas said a lot of things," she said. "Most of them weren't true." "Evelyn." Silas's voice shifted to something lower, more direct. The performance was done. "You are a woman with nothing. You are living in this man's house under an arrangement that the entire valley is already talking about. I am offering you a way out of that. Money. A fresh start somewhere that doesn't know your name. And in return, all I need is your signature on one document." "No," she said. "Think carefully." "I've thought carefully," she said. "No. You're making this more complicated than—" "You should go," Gideon said. He was standing now. He hadn't moved with any drama. He'd simply stood up, and the room changed with it. He was not a man who took up more space than he needed, but he took up all of the space he needed, and right now that was considerable. "And you should take those 2 men at my fence with you." Silas looked at Gideon for a long moment. He was calculating, she could see it, calculating whether the 2 men at the fence were going to be useful in this situation or whether he was in a room with a man who had decided he was done being reasonable and whether those were odds he wanted. He decided they weren't. "I'll be back," he said to Evelyn. "And next time I won't be asking. Next time you come to my property," Gideon said, "you'll want a document that's worth the paper it's printed on, not whatever Garner's county man put together on a Tuesday afternoon." Silas left. The 2 men at the fence left with him. They watched from the porch until the 3 horses were well down the north road. Then Gideon said, "Go inside. I need to check the fence line." She almost laughed. "The fence line." "Something to do while I think," he said, and went. She went inside and stood at the window and watched him walk the perimeter of the north fence with his hands in his pockets and his head down in the particular way he had when he was working something out. And she thought about the word "next time" in Silas's mouth. He'd meant it. She knew him well enough for that. Men like Silas didn't make the kind of investment he'd made. The ride, the preparation, the documents, the hired men, and walk away from it because someone said no the second time. He'd come back. Different angle, same destination. And the specific threat wasn't violence, or not primarily violence. It was the document. One document that gave Garner's operation a legal question mark over Gideon's north boundary would be enough. Not enough to take the land outright, but enough to drag it into a territorial court for long enough to cost more in legal fees than a remote rancher could absorb. That was how men like Garner worked. Not through force, through paperwork and patience. She sat down at the table with the survey document and looked at it for a long time. She was not a woman without resources. People had decided she was, because she'd arrived here with nothing, but nothing, and no resources were different things. She could read. She could write. She had spent 3 years managing Thomas's business correspondence when Thomas found correspondence inconvenient, which meant she knew more about territorial land law than anyone in Blackthorn would have guessed. Because you learned the law when you were the one handling the papers, and you were smart enough to know that understanding them was protection. She read the survey document again, more carefully this time. She found what she was looking for on the 3rd page. When Gideon came back in from his fence line thinking, she had the document on the table with a line underscored by her fingernail. "Look at this," she said. He came and looked. "The survey date," she said. "This was commissioned 14 months ago, before Thomas died, before any of the debt proceedings. Which means Garner was planning this before Thomas died," Gideon said slowly. "Which means Thomas might not have been involved in any genuine sense," she said. "Silas probably found out about this plan after Thomas died and saw an opportunity. Use Thomas's debts as a vehicle to approach me. Get me to sign something that gives this survey teeth." She sat back. "But the survey itself is Garner's. If it was commissioned without proper county authorization, there's a county recorder in Hatchfield," Gideon said. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it. Survey commissions have to be filed with the recorder's office within 30 days. If this one wasn't filed, then it's not valid, she said. It might not be valid regardless. My deed has a recorded survey from 8 years ago. You can't just commission a new one and have it supersede." He stopped. He looked at her. "How do you know this much about land surveys?" "Thomas found legal correspondence unpleasant," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite any one thing. Respect, and something warmer than that, and the specific look of a man who is understanding all at once the actual dimensions of the person he's been living alongside. "I need to go to Hatchfield," he said. "We need to go to Hatchfield," she said. Evelyn, it's my name on that debt document," she said. "I have the right to challenge it, and I can read the county filings faster than you can. I know what I'm looking for." She looked at him directly. "We need to go to Hatchfield." He was quiet. Then, "It's a 2-day ride." "I know. Weather's not settled." "I know that too." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and went to check the condition of his better horse. They left the following morning in the cold gray hour before full light. The ride to Hatchfield was not comfortable. The road south was not much of a road, and the late February cold had its own ideas about cooperation. But they rode at a steady pace, and they talked more than they usually did, because riding side by side through empty country loosens things that sitting across a table sometimes doesn't. He told her about his father's land back east, how he'd watched it get taken by a bank debt when he was 17, legally and properly, every document in order, and how that experience had given him a specific relationship with paperwork ever since. A combination of respect for what it could do and hostility toward the people who weaponized it. She told him about the letters she'd written for Thomas, how she'd started to understand gradually that the business Thomas described to her verbally and the business that actually appeared in the documents were not always the same business, and how she'd kept the discrepancy to herself because she hadn't known what to do with it, and Thomas had a way of making her doubt what she'd clearly read. "Why did you stay with him?" Gideon asked. They were on a ridge section of the road where the horses had to pick their way single file, so she was behind him, and she thought maybe that was why he could ask it, neither of them having to watch the other's face. "At first because I believed him when he said things would change," she said. "Then because leaving seemed like admitting I'd made a mistake I couldn't afford to have made." She paused. "And then because I got used to it. That's the worst reason. Getting used to something is not the same as it being all right, but from the inside they feel the same after long enough." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" She thought about it. "Now I think the worst thing that ever happened to me might also be the thing that made me someone I'd rather be," she said. "I'm still figuring out if that's worth it." "It's not either or," he said. "It can be both." She held that for a while, there on the cold ridge with the horses breathing white clouds, and the valley spread out below them in the winter light. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. If this doesn't work, if the filings are in order and Garner's document holds up, then we find another way," he said. "There might not be another way." "There's always another way," he said. "Sometimes it's just worse than the first one." She almost smiled. It was such a specific, honest thing to say. Not reassurance, not false comfort, just the blunt and practicable truth of a man who had been solving hard problems alone for 7 years and had learned to stop expecting them to be simple. The valley fell further behind them. The road descended toward Hatchfield. The cold pressed on. They pressed back. That was how they did things, the two of them. It was not graceful, and it was not guaranteed, and it was the most honest approach to the world she'd ever been part of. She kept riding. Hatchfield's county recorder office was a low-ceilinged room in the back of the territorial administration building that smelled like old paper and coal smoke, run by a small, meticulous man named Aldous Finch, who had the air of someone who had made peace with spending his life in a room full of documents, and occasionally resented the people who only showed up when they needed something. Evelyn explained what they were looking for. Finch looked at her over his glasses with the specific expression of a man deciding whether she was going to be worth the bother. She met his eyes and waited. He pulled the Survey Commission ledger. She found it in 11 minutes. The commission had been filed 22 months ago, not 14 as the document date suggested, which meant someone had backdated the survey record. And the filing signature was not from a county surveyor. It was from a private surveying firm out of Fort Carver, which meant it had been filed through the wrong channel, which meant under territorial recording law, as she explained to Finch in clear and unambiguous language, it had no legal standing as a county document. Finch looked at the ledger and then at her and then at Gideon. She's right, he said, with the tone of a man who is impressed but would rather not show it. I'd like a certified statement to that effect, Evelyn said. Finch produced one. He charged them $1 for it, which was probably slightly more than it should have cost, but she paid it without comment and folded the statement and put it in her coat. Outside in the cold Hatchfield street, Gideon looked at her. 11 minutes, he said. I knew what I was looking for, she said. Still, she felt the statement in her coat pocket. One piece of paper, properly signed, that turned Garner's document from a weapon into a nuisance. It didn't solve everything. Garner was not a man who gave up because one approach failed, and Silas would find another angle eventually, and the Valley Council still had opinions about her presence at Gideon's ranch. None of that was resolved, but this particular threat was done. She looked down the street at the cold and unfamiliar town, and she thought about Silas saying, "You're not as stupid as Thomas always said." She thought about what it meant that Thomas had said that the man she'd been married to had needed her to be less than she was in order to be comfortable. She thought about what it meant that she'd let him. And she thought about Gideon, who had handed her a hammer on the third day and assumed she'd use it right. "We should find somewhere to sleep," she said. "It's too late to start back tonight." "There's a boarding house on the East End," he said. "Nothing special." "Nothing special is fine," she said. "I've got a low bar for what constitutes good enough these days." He looked at her with that almost smile. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They walked toward the boarding house in the cold, and the document was in her pocket, and the valley was 2 days north, and Silas Mercer was still out there somewhere with plans she hadn't fully mapped yet. But she had the paper, and she had the knowledge, and she was beginning to understand, with a certainty that felt new and solid in a way certainty hadn't felt in a long time, that those two things together were more powerful than anything Silas or Garner or the entire Blackthorn Valley Council could assemble against her. She was not the woman on the platform anymore. She wasn't entirely sure when that had changed. She thought maybe it had been changing the whole time, one fence board and one coffee cup and one cold morning at a time, so gradually that she'd looked up one day and it was already done. The ride back from Hatchfield took 2.5 days instead of 2. A storm came down from the northern ridge on the second morning, not violent enough to stop them, but insistent enough to slow everything. The horses picking their steps carefully on roads that had gone slick overnight, the wind cutting sideways with a persistence that made conversation difficult and made the work of simply moving forward require the whole of your attention. They rode mostly in silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that two people fall into when the conditions demand it and neither of them minds. Evelyn kept the certified statement inside her coat, against her chest, where body heat kept the paper from going stiff in the cold. She was aware of it the whole ride, the way you're aware of something you've worked hard for. Not obsessively, just present, like a fact you keep confirming is still true. They came down out of the ridge road in the late afternoon of the third day, with the ranch visible in the valley below, the cabin smoke rising straight up in the cold, still air, the cattle moving slow and dark against the snow. She'd seen that view now maybe 40 times since November, and it still did something to her chest that she hadn't figured out how to categorize. It looked like something that would still be there tomorrow. That sounds simple. It wasn't. "Fence held," Gideon said, looking at the north boundary line. "It usually does when you build it right," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Was that a compliment?" "It was an observation." "Uh-huh," he said, and clicked his horse forward, and she followed, and that was the closest either of them had come to flirting in 4 months of living under the same roof, which probably said something about both of them. The certified statement went to Rupert Calloway 2 days after they returned, delivered by hand on a Thursday morning that was cold enough to make the walk to town feel like a personal argument with the weather. Gideon had offered to go alone. Evelyn had declined the offer in the specific way she'd developed for declining things she intended to do regardless. Not argumentatively, just with the quiet finality of someone who has already decided. Calloway's office was a cluttered room above the feed store that smelled like tobacco and old decisions. And Calloway himself was a man who had spent enough years being the loudest voice in every room that he'd forgotten how to moderate his volume for situations that required it. He took the certified statement and read it with the expression of a man reading something he'd rather not have to deal with. "This doesn't resolve the debt claim itself," he said. The debt claim is documented through private correspondence with no county magistrate signature, Evelyn said, which you would have seen when you reviewed the documents Silas Mercer brought through your office. Calloway's eyes moved to Gideon, then back. I don't recall Mercer coming through my office. He came through your office the same week he came to the ranch, Evelyn said, because he'd have needed local standing to make the claim official, and you're the local authority. She held his gaze. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you that I know how this process works, and I want you to know that I know. The room was quiet. Calloway's mouth compressed into a thin line. The survey's invalid, he said finally. I can note that for the record. I'd appreciate it, she said. Outside, walking back, Gideon said, You didn't have to threaten him. I didn't threaten him. I informed him. The difference is subtle. The difference is everything, she said. A threat is what you make when you don't have the information. What I did was tell him the information exists and that I have it. That's not the same thing. He was quiet for a half a block. When did you get like this? Like what? Like this. He gestured vaguely, which was not a precise description, but she understood it. I was always like this, she said. I just didn't have anywhere to put it. He didn't say anything to that, but she could feel him thinking about it, the way you feel a fire warming a room even with your back to it. March arrived with the particular grudging quality of a season that isn't ready to change but has run out of reasons to stay. The snow was still on the ground, but the quality of it had shifted. Denser, wetter, with a crust of ice over the top that broke under your boots with a sound like cracking glass. The days were longer by real increments now. You could feel it in the late afternoon light, a goldness to it that hadn't been there in February. A suggestion that the world was considering other options. The grazing rights renewal came through on a Tuesday in the second week of March. Calloway sent a rider with the paperwork, not the usual procedure, which would have been Gideon making the trip to town, which Evelyn read as an acknowledgement of something, though she didn't say so to Gideon. He read the paperwork, confirmed the north boundary description was correct, signed where required, and put it in the tin box where he kept important documents with the same unsentimental efficiency he brought to everything. That's done then, he said. For the year, she said. Garner will try something else when the renewal comes around again. Probably, he said, but we'll know what to look for. We. He said it without thinking. She was fairly sure. Said it the way you say things that have become natural, that have stopped requiring the weight of consideration. She caught it and didn't comment on it and held it somewhere quiet. That same week, Silas made one more appearance. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to town, to the general store, on a Saturday morning when the weekly activity brought people in from the surrounding ranches and farms, when there was an audience. She saw him before he saw her, across the length of Mabel Price's store, and she had exactly 5 seconds to decide what kind of woman she was going to be in this particular room. She decided to be the kind who kept shopping. She was at the flower bin when he crossed to her. She could feel the room shift, the attention moving, the conversations dropping to a lower register, the particular quality of a public space waiting for something to happen. Evelyn, he said, I heard about Hatchfield. Then you know the survey doesn't hold, she said. She didn't look up from the flower. The survey was one approach, he said. There are others. I'm sure there are. She weighed the flower. Is there something specific you needed to say, Silas? Because I have a list. He stepped slightly closer. I want you to understand something, he said, low enough that only she could hear it clearly, though she was fairly sure Mabel Price and at least 2 other women in the store were working very hard at their proximity. What's between you and Wolf? Whatever you think it is. It's not going to hold. Men like him don't stay interested in women with your kind of history. When he's done with you, you'll be exactly where you were in November. Except there'll be one more thing for people to say about you. She set the scoop down. She turned and looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the quality of his certainty. He believed what he was saying, she realized. He genuinely believed it, the way people believe things they've seen proven out often enough that they've stopped questioning the pattern. You came back to Blackthorn to tell me that, she said. I came back because the situation isn't resolved. You came back to make me doubt, she said, because the document didn't work and the debt claim didn't work, and so now you're trying something different. She picked up her bag. Silas, I've been doubting myself for 6 years. I know what it feels like from the inside. And what you're doing right now doesn't feel like anything except what it is. She walked past him to the counter. He said behind her, ask him why he's never married. Ask him what happened to the last woman who tried to live on that ranch. She stopped. Not because it rattled her, because she wanted to be honest with herself about whether it should. She thought about Gideon, about 7 years alone in the high country, by choice and then by habit, about Cole Rathbone and the note and his half of the flour. She didn't know everything about the years before she arrived. She knew what he'd told her and what she'd learned from being in the same space as him for 4 months. And what she knew was that he was a man who had been hurt and had rebuilt around it, imperfectly, and who was still in the process of deciding whether to trust the rebuilding. That was not a warning sign. That was a human being. She put her money on the counter and picked up her flour and walked out of the store. Gideon was at the wagon. He looked at her face, and then at the door she'd come through, and then back at her. Silas, she said. His jaw tightened. What did he say? Nothing important. She put the flour in the back of the wagon. He asked me to ask you why you've never married and what happened to the last woman who lived on the ranch. Gideon was very still for a moment. Do you want to tell me? She said. He looked down the street. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying something for long enough that he's stopped noticing the weight until someone points at it. There wasn't a last woman, he said. Not the way he's implying. A woman came out to look at the property years ago when I was thinking about selling. She stayed 2 nights. She decided the isolation wasn't for her. He looked at Evelyn. That's the whole story. That's it. That's it. A pause. Small towns need their stories. When there isn't one, they build one. She nodded. She climbed up to the bench. He climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins and then he said, without looking at her, I never married because I never met anyone who made me want to change the way I lived until recently. He clicked the horses forward. The wagon moved. Evelyn looked straight ahead at the road and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 years, the specific warmth of being wanted for what you actually were. Not the version of yourself you'd contracted to perform for someone else's comfort. It was a different thing entirely. It landed differently. In the chest rather than the head, spreading slow, not going anywhere. She didn't say anything. He didn't seem to need her to. The last week of March brought a thing nobody had expected. Warmth. Not spring exactly. Not yet, but a suggestion of it. 3 consecutive days where the temperature climbed above freezing by early afternoon, and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to pull back, exposing the dark, wet ground underneath. The cattle moved differently in it. She moved differently in it. Even Gideon, who conducted himself with the same steady purposefulness regardless of season, spent longer outside in the evenings, standing on the porch looking at the ridge with his coffee, as though the mountains were telling him something he'd been waiting to hear. They repaired the barn's south wall together that week, where a board had shifted and let cold air into the corner stall all winter. It was a half-day job, straightforward, nothing technical about it, and they worked through it with the easy, wordless coordination that she'd noticed building between them over months, the kind where you don't have to say which end you're taking or whether you're ready because the other person can already see it. They were finishing the last nail when she said, I want to tell you something. He waited. When I came here, she said, measuring the words carefully, I thought the best I could hope for was to get through, to get to the other side of what had happened and be functional and not owe anyone anything. She looked at the board she'd just hammered flat. I didn't think there was anything on the other side worth wanting. I thought that was just what happened to you when enough things went wrong. You stopped wanting things because it was less dangerous. He was quiet. I was wrong about that, she said. She looked up at him. I just wanted you to know. He held her gaze. His were dark and steady, and held the specific quality she'd come to recognize as him paying complete attention, the kind he usually reserved for problems that mattered. Evelyn, he said, you don't have to say anything. I want to, he said. He set down the hammer and turned to face her properly. When I drove into Blackthorn in November, I told myself it was because what they were doing was wrong and someone should do something about it. He paused. That was true, but it wasn't everything that was true. She waited. I'd seen you, he said, twice before, at the mill and at the feed store, and I'd thought... He stopped, worked on something, tried again. I'd thought that you looked like someone who was managing something nobody was helping her manage. And I'd done what I always did, which was mind my own business and keep moving. And then November came, and I drove past the platform, and I thought if I keep driving, I will spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to do the one thing that would have made a difference, and I didn't. She said nothing. Something in her throat had closed in a way that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything else. That's the real reason, he said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the actual reason, and not just the version that sounds more practical. She looked at him in the pale late March afternoon light, standing in the barn doorway with sawdust on his coat and a direct, slightly uncomfortable honesty on his face that she'd learned was as close to vulnerable as he knew how to get. He was not a romantic figure in the conventional sense. He was a man with a patched coat and a 7-year habit of solitude and a way of caring about things that was so understated that you could miss it if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. She had been paying the right kind of attention. I know, she said. I think I've known for a while. And? His voice was level, but she could hear the weight underneath it. And I'm still here, she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was the truest thing she could say. He exhaled slowly. He nodded once. And then he picked up the hammer and they finished the wall and went inside for dinner. And the thing between them had been named finally, not in the way of stories, but in the way of real people who don't quite know how to do the big moment and do it anyway in the only language they have. April came with its particular cruelty of hope. The snow melted in earnest. Not gracefully. Nothing about late-season snowmelt was graceful. It turned everything to mud, and the mud had opinions about everything. And the valley began to look like itself again underneath the months of white. Green showed up first at the creek edges and worked its way up the slope. And the cattle noticed it before the people did, moving toward it with the patient certainty of animals who trust the season. They were planting the kitchen garden in the first week of April when Clara Holt rode in again. The comparison to her first visit was not lost on Evelyn. Same horse, same deliberate energy. But this time Clara tied her horse herself at the post and came to the garden rather than to the door, and she had a different quality about her. Less mission, more intention. I heard about Hatchfield, Clara said, and about Calloway, and about what you said to Silas Mercer in the store. Evelyn pressed a seed into the soil. Which part? All of it. Clara stood at the garden edge and looked at her. I owe you an apology. Clara, I came here in December to warn you, but what I was actually doing was telling you that the town's comfort was more important than your dignity, and I dressed it up as friendship. Clara's voice was flat and honest, the voice of someone who has been sitting with something uncomfortable long enough to stop dressing it up. That wasn't right. Evelyn looked up at her. I was scared, Clara said, of being associated with, of what people would say if I was seen defending you, and I told myself I was being practical. She paused. I wasn't being practical. I was being a coward. The garden was quiet. A bird was doing something complicated in the pine tree at the fence corner. I know what that is, Evelyn said. Getting used to something being easier than fighting it. She sat back on her heels. I don't hold it against you. You should, a little, Clara said. At least enough to let me fix it. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Do you know anything about kitchen gardens? I know enough, Clara said, and she came through the gate and knelt in the mud, and they worked for 2 hours in the April afternoon and talked, really talked, the way women talk when they've stopped performing their versions of themselves for each other. About Thomas, and about Blackthorn, and about what it cost to be a woman in a place that had already decided who you were. Clara stayed for dinner. Gideon sat at the table with the quiet ease of a man who trusted Evelyn's judgment about people and didn't need to insert himself into a conversation that wasn't his. And that particular quality of trust, which she'd come to recognize and rely on, moved through her chest like something permanent being laid down. After Clara left, Evelyn washed the plates and Gideon dried them, and they stood at the basin together in the domestic nearness of people who have stopped being careful about proximity, and she said, Clara's going to talk to people. I know, he said. It might not make a difference. It might make a difference to some people, he said. That's enough. She handed him the last plate. You're very unbothered by things that should bother you. He looked at her sideways. You've said that before. Keeps being true. He set the plate on the shelf. He turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her with that steady, dark attention. "I've just spent a long time being bothered by things I couldn't change," he said. "I got tired of it. The only things worth bothering about are the ones you can actually do something with." "And what are those?" "This ranch," he said. "The work. The people in it." A pause that had weight in it. "You?" She looked at him. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the April dark was soft, and the frogs had started up at the creek, which meant the temperature had held above freezing for 3 nights running. She crossed the 2 feet of space between them. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart, the way you touch something you want to confirm is real. He was very still. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm. Steady, not slow exactly, but present. Real. He put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a moment that was longer than a moment. And it was not cinematic, and it was not easy, and there was still everything outside that door that had always been outside that door. The town, and the gossip, and Garner's designs on the north boundary, and the permanent question of what happened next. But none of that was in the kitchen right now. What was in the kitchen was a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing, and a man who had been waiting for something worth opening back up for, and the space between them that had been closing since November had finally, without ceremony or announcement, closed. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not an apology, just the truth. "Neither do I," he said. "I haven't in a long time. So we'll figure it out." "Yeah," he said. "We will." Ma. The remainder of April moved with the particular quality of something new, being handled carefully because neither of them wanted to break it by moving too fast or demanding more than what was naturally there. They didn't transform overnight. There were no overnight transformations. What there were accumulations. His hand at the small of her back when she passed him in the narrow kitchen space, her leaning against the porch post beside him in the evenings instead of standing separate. The way he started telling her things in advance rather than after the fact, as though her knowing was part of how he processed the knowing himself. There were also difficulties. He had a temper he kept controlled mostly, but it showed up sideways sometimes. In the set of his jaw when a piece of equipment failed at the wrong moment. In the clipped quality his words got when he was tired and something else went wrong. She learned to recognize it and give it room rather than pushing at it, which took her a few weeks to get right because her instinct when she sensed displeasure was still to make herself smaller, and making herself smaller was not something she was willing to keep doing. She told him that. "I noticed you doing it," he said. "Making yourself smaller, when you think I'm angry." "I'm working on it," she said. "I know." He looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, You're not doing it on purpose," she said, "but you should know I'm going to push back when I notice it. That's not going to change." He looked at her. "Good," he said. "I'd rather you push back than disappear." She had not expected him to say it that directly. She'd expected the conversation to be harder. She'd expected him to be defensive about the temper, the way Thomas had been defensive about everything that required him to account for himself. He wasn't Thomas. She knew that. She had known it since November, in some part of herself. But the knowing and the trusting were different things, and the trusting was still being built, one direct conversation at a time. "We're going to have a lot of these conversations," she said. "I expect so," he said. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it genuinely, which was one of the things she valued in him. He didn't answer before he'd actually considered. "No," he said. "It bothers me less than the alternative." "Which is?" "Which is not having them," he said. "Which is just going along and not saying the thing. I did that for a long time, alone and before that with people I was trying to keep from leaving." He looked at the table. "Didn't work either way. At least this way, whatever happens, it's honest." She absorbed that. "You were always afraid people would leave." "Everyone does eventually," he said. "I figured if I made myself easy enough to be around and didn't ask for much, they'd stay longer," she said. "Or at least have less reason to go," he said. "It's a stupid way to do it." "It's a human way to do it," she said. He looked at her. "You're doing it too, making yourself useful, making sure you're earning your place, so I won't have less reason to let me go," she said. Her voice was even. "Yes, I know." They sat with that for a moment. Two people who had both learned love as a transaction and were in the uncomfortable process of learning it differently. We're a mess, she said. Yeah, he said. We are. But he was almost smiling when he said it, and she was almost smiling too, and that was something. Two people who could see their own damage clearly and were choosing to sit across from it together rather than alone. Outside, April was doing its slow, determined work. The kitchen garden was coming up. The cattle were moving to the south pasture where the grass was coming in. Every evening, the light held a little longer, and every morning, the world outside the cabin window looked incrementally more like something worth building toward. She was not fixed. He was not fixed. The ranch still had a contested north boundary, and the town still had its opinions, and Silas Mercer was still out there somewhere with his pale eyes and his calculations. But she woke up in the mornings wanting to know what the day would bring, which was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. It was the whole distance between surviving and living, covered in the space of one winter on a hard ranch in a cold valley with an imperfect man who had made her 2 cups of coffee every morning without ever being asked. She made 2 cups now. Most mornings she was up first. The morning Silas Mercer rode into Blackthorn Valley for the last time, Evelyn was in the kitchen garden with dirt on her knees and her hair coming loose from its braid, pulling the early weeds that had decided to arrive before anything she'd actually planted. She didn't know it was the last time yet. She found that out later. What she knew in that moment was the particular satisfaction of early May work. The ground soft enough to cooperate, the air carrying that specific smell of warming earth that meant the season had finally committed to something. And the way the kitchen garden had come up in the 2 weeks since she and Clara had planted it, with a reliability that still surprised her, even though she'd planted gardens before and knew that seeds generally did what they were supposed to do. Gideon had gone to the south pasture at first light to check on a section of fence that had been worrying him. She'd heard him leave. She heard most things now, had learned the specific sound of his boots on the porch boards, the particular way the barn door moved, and she'd stayed in bed for another half hour in the luxury of not having to pretend she was more rested than she was. And then she'd gotten up and made coffee and come out to the garden because the weeds didn't care about her sleep schedule. She was on her 3rd row when she heard the horse. Not Gideon. Wrong direction. Wrong pace. She sat back on her heels and looked toward the north road and felt the specific quality of recognition that the body registers before the mind catches up. A tightening, a readiness, something that had learned Silas Mercer as a threat and responded accordingly. He rode in alone this time. No hired men at the fence line. That was different, and the difference required reading. He came through the gate without asking permission, which was the same as always, but he stopped his horse farther from the cabin than he usually did. He dismounted and tied the horse, and he stood there for a moment, which was also different, and she understood from that pause that something had shifted in him between his last visit and this one. She stood up. She didn't move toward him, and she didn't move away. She waited. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You've needed that before," she said. "Usually it turns out you need something else. This is different." He looked worse than she'd ever seen him. Not physically, exactly, but in the way of a man who has been running a long play and watched it come apart and is now in the unpleasant process of calculating what he has left. His coat was travel-worn, and his eyes had lost the assessing quality that she'd come to think of as his primary mode. He just looked tired. Can I come in?" She thought about it honestly rather than reflexively. "You can stand there," she said. "Say what you came to say." He nodded. He took his hat off and held it in front of him, which was such an unexpectedly humble gesture that it almost disarmed her. Almost. "Garner's done," he said. "The operation in Fort Carver, the land scheme. The county recorder in Hatchfield started an inquiry after you were there. That inquiry connected back to a survey Garner's man commissioned in 3 other territories using the same method." He paused. "There are federal marshals involved now. Garner's been told to appear before a territorial court in June." She looked at him steadily. "And you?" He was quiet. "Silas, what was your part in it?" He turned the hat in his hands. "I was the connection," he said, "between Garner's operation and the local creditors. I found people like Thomas, people with debts and assets that could be useful, and I made introductions." His jaw moved. "I didn't commission any surveys, I didn't falsify any documents, but I knew what the documents were for." "So you're here because the inquiry is coming and you want—" "I'm here because you deserve to know," he said. and his voice had something raw in it that she hadn't heard there before. Whatever else I am, and I know what I am, you deserve to know that the threat to this ranch is gone. Garner's finished. Without him, there's nothing driving the boundary dispute. Calloway will let the grazing rights stand. She looked at him for a long moment. Out past his shoulder, the valley was doing its May business. The light long in gold, the grass coming in green along the creek, a hawk working the thermals above the ridge. "Why does it matter to you that I know?" she asked. He looked down at his hat. "Thomas talked about you," he said, "when he was trying to get money from people. When he needed someone to vouch for his reliability, he'd tell stories about his wife, how capable she was, how she kept things running." He looked up. "He used you as a character reference while he was doing the thing that would undo everything. I always thought that was—" He stopped. "I thought that was a specific kind of wrong." "But you still helped him," she said. "I still helped him," he said, "and I came here and I tried to use you the same way he did." He put his hat back on. "I know an apology isn't worth much." "No," she said. "It isn't." "I know." They stood in the morning light with everything said and nowhere particular left to go with it. "Go deal with the inquiry," she said finally. "Whatever comes of it, deal with it straight. That's all I have to say to you." He nodded. He untied his horse. He mounted and he rode back out the gate and down the north road, and she watched him go with a feeling she couldn't precisely name. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever completely, but something adjacent to understanding. The recognition that people could be genuinely rotten in specific ways and genuinely decent in others, and that both things could be true without canceling each other out. She stood in the garden for a while after he was gone and thought about Thomas, about the character reference, about the man who had talked about her capability to other men while making sure she never had room to actually use it. She thought about the girl by the river at 15, wanting to know what it felt like to be somewhere without expectations attached. She thought she understood now what that girl had actually wanted, which wasn't the absence of expectation, but the presence of the right kind. The kind that came from someone who believed in you and let you prove it, rather than containing you to the size of their comfort. She went back to the weeds. There was still half a row left, and they weren't going to pull themselves. "Come on." Gideon came back from the south pasture at mid-morning, and she told him about Silas while they stood at the water basin washing up before coffee. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic, and then he was quiet for a moment that had thought in it. "Federal marshals," he said, "involved as of whenever Silas found out, which was probably recent. He looked like a man who hasn't slept well." "Garner in June." "Territorial court." He dried his hands. "The north boundary question dies with the survey," he said. "Calloway's not going to push a fight he can't back up legally, not with a federal inquiry connected to the source document." "That's what Silas said." He looked at her. "How do you feel about it? Him coming here?" She considered that. "Complicated," she said. "He did a bad thing, and then told me about it, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't think it makes him good. I don't think it makes him irredeemable either." She paused. "Mostly I feel like it's done, like the last thing that was chasing me from before finally stopped." Gideon nodded slowly. He poured 2 cups of coffee and put them on the table and sat down. She sat across from him. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked up. "What did you mean?" "I mean," he looked at the cup, then at her. "The reason you came here is resolved. The debts are cleared. The threat to the ranch is gone. You're not on contract. You haven't been on contract for months, if I'm being straight about it." His voice was even, but she'd learned his voice well enough to hear what was underneath it. "So I'm asking, what do you want to do?" She understood what he was actually asking. He was asking it the only way he knew how, not romantically, not with any of the language that the situation might have warranted in a different kind of story between different kinds of people. He was asking it practically, the way he asked everything that mattered to him, because practical was the language he trusted to carry real weight. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. I was up before you this morning." He looked at her. "I made the coffee," she said, "both cups, because I wanted to, not because it's my job or because I owe you or because I'm working out a debt." She held his gaze. "I made the coffee because this is where I live and you're who I live here with, and that's my answer." He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't entirely control. Relief, she thought, and something that had been held at tension for a long time releasing. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Good," he said. His voice was rougher than usual on that single word. Good. They drank their coffee, and the morning moved around them, and outside the valley was doing the work of becoming itself again after the winter, and neither of them said anything more about it because neither of them needed to. The thing that happened in town in the second week of May was not something either of them had planned for. It happened the way significant things often happen in small places, out of nothing, in the middle of an ordinary errand, in front of everyone. They'd come in for supplies on a Saturday. The usual route: feed store, general store, the post, and back. Standard. They'd done this run a dozen times, and each time the experience had been approximately the same. Polite minimums from most people, deliberate not quite acknowledgement from a few, the ongoing low-grade social weather of being Evelyn Hart in a town that had already cataloged her. What was different this Saturday was Clara Holt standing outside the general store talking to 3 women from the southern farms, and the way Clara looked up when Evelyn came down the street and said, not quietly, not to just the women beside her, but in the general direction of the street, "Evelyn, I want you to meet some people." Evelyn slowed. Clara had been different since April. The Clara who had apologized in the garden was conducting herself differently in public, with the specific determination of someone who has decided that social cowardice has a cost and they're done paying it. She'd talk to people. Evelyn knew this in the abstract. She hadn't expected to see it demonstrated in the middle of Main Street on a Saturday in May. The 3 women were Margaret Sills from the Southern Valley, her daughter-in-law Ruth, and a woman named Frances Cord, who had come to the territory 2 years ago with her husband, and who had, Clara had mentioned once, been having a difficult time finding her footing in Blackthorn's particular social architecture. Clara introduced Evelyn with the simple, uncomplicated ease of someone introducing 2 people who have every reason to know each other and no particular reason not to. Not with context, not with the careful management of information that introductions in Blackthorn usually required, the way people embedded your history and how they presented you, so everyone knew where to place you before you opened your mouth. Just, Evelyn Wolfe. She's been up at the North Valley Ranch. Evelyn heard the name. Not Hart, not widow, not the woman from the auction platform in November. Just Evelyn Wolfe, which was not even technically accurate yet, which Clara had said with the ease of someone establishing a fact that just hadn't been formalized. She absorbed it. She shook hands. She answered Margaret Sill's question about the kitchen garden with the straightforward helpfulness of someone who knew about kitchen gardens and was willing to share what she knew. And Frances Cord asked about the North Valley Road in winter. She'd been thinking about visiting a friend on the far ridge and hadn't been sure of the route. And Evelyn told her what she knew, and the conversation moved with the ordinary, unremarkable ease of people talking about practical things. She didn't cry. She'd never been much for crying. But there was something in her chest for the rest of that afternoon that was warm and slightly unwieldy, and that she suspected, if she examined it too closely, was going to turn out to be something like joy, which she hadn't trusted in long enough that she'd mostly stopped expecting it. Gideon was at the wagon when she got back. He looked at her face. "Good?" he said. "Yeah," she said. "Good." He loaded the feed and they drove home, and the valley sat in the long May afternoon light around them, and nobody said much, and it was the best kind of nothing to say. The conversation that changed the shape of their future came on a Sunday evening at the end of May, when the day's work was done and the light was holding late the way it did that time of year, gold and extended, making the world look like it was in no particular hurry. They were on the porch. He had coffee. She had the last of the afternoon sun on her face, which she was not going to give up for anything. "I want to expand the herd," he said. She opened her eyes. "How much?" "Another 20 head, if the south pasture supports it. The grass has been better this year than last." He looked out at the ridge. "I'd need to build another section of fencing, probably another water point." "You'd need help," she said. "I've been thinking about taking on a hand," he said. "Someone who knows cattle, part-time, at least through summer." "That makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd also need capital. Some of the expansion costs more than I have liquid." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about the south quarter of the property, the corner section by the creek. I don't use it. It's not good grazing and it's too rocky for crops, but it has water rights attached to it. You want to sell it? I want us to decide whether to sell it, he said. The distinction was quiet and it was enormous, and he had said it in the same practical tone he used for everything important, which was how she knew it was important. Us. Not as a casual slip, not the way he'd said we that time in March before either of them had named anything. Deliberate. A word chosen for what it meant. She looked at him. You're asking me, she said. It's your home too, he said. Has been for a while. I should have been asking before now. He paused. I'm asking now. She thought about the South Quarter. She'd walked that corner in late April when the snow had pulled back from it, rocky ground, good water, a section of creek bank that caught the afternoon sun. He was right that it wasn't prime grazing, but the water rights were worth something, and the creek bank had a quality she'd noticed and filed away. The kind of ground that might do something interesting if someone wanted to try. Don't sell it yet, she said. He looked at her. The creek bank, she said. Give me one season with it. I want to try something. What kind of something? I grew up watching my mother keep bees, she said. There's water and there's south sun and there's enough flowering ground on that bank. If I can get a hive established. She stopped because she could hear herself and she was aware of how it sounded, asking for a season on a piece of his land to keep bees while he was trying to solve a capital problem. Or we sell it. If you need the money now, tell me about the bees, he said. She told him. She told him what she knew from watching her mother. How you started a colony, what they needed, what they produced, what the market for honey and wax was worth in a territory where both were scarce. She told him it wasn't fast money, that the first season was all establishment, that there was no guarantee, that she'd never done it herself, and her knowledge was secondhand. She told him all the reasons it was a risk, because she had learned by now that he made better decisions with honest information, and she was not going to manage what she told him to make the outcome easier. He listened to all of it. One season, he said. If it doesn't take, we talk about the sale in the fall. That's fair, she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at the ridge for a moment and then back at her with the expression she'd come to know as him, about to say the thing that was underneath the thing he'd been saying. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. I've been thinking about how to say this for a while, he said, and I've concluded that there's no way to say it that doesn't sound like I've been rehearsing it, so I'm just going to say it. She waited. I want you to stay here not because you work here or because the arrangement has been convenient or because it makes practical sense, he said. I want you to stay here as my wife, as my partner, equal share in the decisions, equal share in the work, equal say in what this place becomes. He looked at her directly. Not because I rescued you and you owe me. Not because I don't want to be alone. Because you are the best person I know, and this is better with you in it, and I would very much like, for it to stay that way. It was not a polished speech. There were places where the syntax got away from him, and places where he was clearly feeling his way through unfamiliar territory. He looked slightly pained by his own sincerity, the way people look when they've said something they mean completely, and they're waiting to find out if it was the right choice. She thought about the platform in November, the rope on her wrists, the $45 bid. She thought about a coat that smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, and the specific moment when she'd understood that someone saw her, not the version that was useful to them or the version that made their life easier, but her. She thought about the bees, about a season on a creek bank with good south sun, trying something she'd never done, not knowing if it would work, doing it anyway because the possibility was worth the risk of the failure. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. He nodded once with the compressed, relieved quality of a man who had been holding something at tension and has just been allowed to set it down. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat on the porch in the May evening, and the valley below them held the last of the day's light, and the frogs were going at the creek, and somewhere on the ridge a nighthawk had started up its territorial calling. And it was not a perfect moment because there were no perfect moments. It was just a moment that was completely real, between two completely real people who had earned the right to it the hard way. They married in June, on a Tuesday, because neither of them saw any reason to make it a production, and a Tuesday was when Aldous Finch happened to be passing through Blackthorn on county business and was able to serve as the witnessing official. Clara Holt came. Margaret Sills came. A rancher named Tom Carey from the Eastern Valley, who'd been quietly friendly to Gideon for years, came with his wife. Rupert Calloway came, which surprised Evelyn, and he shook Gideon's hand with a sincerity she hadn't expected from him, and she decided to let that be what it was. Harriet Dunn did not come. Evelyn had not expected her to and spent no particular energy on it. The ceremony was short and honest. They stood in front of Finch in the afternoon light outside the Blackthorn Records office, and they said what needed to be said, which wasn't much because what needed to be said had been said over months, and across fence lines, and in a barn in February cold, and at a kitchen table at midnight, and on a porch in the long spring evenings. The words in front of Finch were the formality that confirmed what was already true. Gideon held her hand and looked at her with that steady, dark attention she had come to think of as the most honest thing she'd ever been offered by another person. And she looked back, and that was the ceremony. Clara cried. Evelyn did not, but she thought she might later, in private, when no one was watching, which was her right. Summer came in full and demanding. The expanded herd required the extra fencing, which they built together across 3 weeks of long days. Evelyn holding boards, and Gideon driving nails, and occasionally reversing this when his shoulders gave out, which happened more than he admitted. They hired a hand named Dix, a quiet man of about 50, who had worked cattle for 30 years and had the unhurried efficiency of someone who had stopped having anything to prove. He fit into the rhythm of the ranch with the natural ease of someone who understood that you didn't impose yourself on a working place. You learned how it already ran and contributed to that. The bees came in July. She'd written to a woman in a settlement 2 territories over who kept hives, whom Clara had found through a chain of correspondence that had taken most of May to complete. The woman sent detailed instructions and a contact for a supplier. And in the second week of July, on a morning that was hot and still and smelled like whatever was flowering along the creek, Evelyn installed her first hive on the south bank of the creek quarter with her hands shaking slightly and a veil over her face that she'd made herself from a pattern in one of Gideon's old newspapers. She got stung twice. This was, the instructions had told her, entirely normal and nothing to worry about. She worried about it anyway. Then she stopped worrying when the colony settled and by the end of July was conducting itself with the focused, purposeful energy of something that had decided this was home. She understood the feeling. Gideon came to look at the hive on a Sunday afternoon, approaching with the careful respect of a man who is outside his own area of knowledge and is aware of it. "They look busy," he said. "They're always busy," she said. "That's the whole thing with bees. They don't have a setting for idle." "How many?" 40, 50,000 in a healthy colony, she said. He looked at the hive with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and personally relieved that they were contained. "And you want more of these?" 2 more hives by next spring, she said, "if this one produces well enough this year to pay for them." He looked at her sideways. "You've got a business plan." "I always have a business plan," she said. "I just haven't always had a business." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You know what you remind me of sometimes?" "What?" "That colony," he said. "Not in a... I mean it as a compliment. The way you just get on with it. The way you decided this was where you were and started building without waiting for permission." She looked at the hive, at the constant, purposeful movement of the bees in the afternoon sun. She thought about what he was saying and whether it was true and decided that it was partly true, which was the best most descriptions of people were. "I waited for permission for a long time," she said. "From Thomas. From the town, from myself even, waiting for myself to feel different enough, fixed enough, finished enough to deserve the things I wanted." She paused. "I got tired of waiting." "What changed?" She thought about it honestly. "Someone handed me a hammer and assumed I'd use it right," she said, "and I realized I'd been waiting for permission that was never going to come from anywhere except me." He was quiet. He had the look of a man taking something in, finding a place for it. "You would have gotten there without me," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Eventually. But it would have taken longer, and I would have been colder." She looked at him. "I'm not dismissing what you did. I'm saying I'm not just what you made possible. Both things are true." He nodded. He understood that. It was one of the things she valued in him. He didn't need her gratitude to be total. He didn't need to be the whole story. He was comfortable being part of it. The harvest that fall was better than the year before. Not exceptional, not the kind that gets talked about in terms of record numbers, just solid and honest and the result of work done right over a full season. The expanded herd had performed well on the south pasture. The kitchen garden had produced more than they could eat, and she'd put up enough preserved jars to see them through winter with room to spare, and had given a portion to Clara, who had given a portion to Francis Cord, who had sent back a note of thanks that was simple and genuine, and that Evelyn kept because she was still learning how to receive things. The bees produced 14 pounds of honey that first season. It wasn't going to make anyone rich, but it paid for the second hive and left a small surplus that she put in the household account under her own name, which was a thing that had not been true for the entirety of her marriage to Thomas, and which she regarded every time she saw it in Calloway's ledger with a satisfaction that was out of proportion to the dollar amount and entirely in proportion to what it represented. On a Saturday in October, she was in town for supplies when she passed the place where the auction platform had stood in November of the year before. It was gone. Had been dismantled in spring, she'd heard, for the lumber, which was a practical use of it. There was nothing there now except the packed earth of the street and the coming and going of ordinary Saturday commerce. She stood there for a moment. Not for long, just long enough. She thought about the woman who had stood on that platform with her wrists bound and her eyes fixed above the crowd's heads, and nothing in front of her that she could see. She thought about what that woman had been expecting and what she'd gotten instead. Life did not owe you a rescue. She'd learned that the hard way, and she believed it still. Nobody was coming for you on a white horse with a simple solution, and anyone who arrived on any kind of horse was going to turn out to be a complicated person with their own damages and blind spots and entirely imperfect way of caring about things. The frontier did not reward waiting for the right conditions. It rewarded the ones who read what was in front of them and acted on it with whatever they had available. What she'd had available in November was a coat that wasn't hers and a deep, bone-level stubbornness about being seen. It had been enough. She thought about what she would say to that woman on the platform, if she could say anything. She thought about it for a moment, and then she thought, not much. Because that woman already knew what she needed to know. She'd known it on the platform, and she'd known it on the wagon ride north, and she'd known it in the barn on the third morning when she'd said, I can help, and meant it. She hadn't needed to be told. She'd needed to be somewhere that would let her act on it. The town moved around her. People went about their Saturday business. A few nodded. Margaret Sills stopped and asked about the garden and whether she'd thought about selling preserves at the market next spring, and she said she'd been considering it. A man she didn't know tipped his hat, and she returned the acknowledgement and kept moving. There was no moment of triumph, no particular recognition. The town was not transformed, and neither was she. What was different was simply the ongoing, daily, accumulated reality of being a person who had built something she chose to be part of. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Quote, the first snow of the new winter came in late November, right on schedule, light at first and then heavier, covering the valley with the same patient indifference that snow had always covered it. Evelyn stood on the porch in the early morning and watched it come and thought about a year ago and where she'd been and who she'd been and the distance between then and now, which was not a distance measurable in miles. Gideon came out behind her. He stood beside her, close, the way he always stood now. First snow, he said. I know, she said. Ready for it? She thought about the cellar, which was stocked, the woodpile, which was the tallest it had ever been, the new fence sections on the south pasture that would hold, the hive, which she'd winterized in October following the instructions she'd memorized, Dix, who would come up from his cabin in the valley when the cattle needed an extra hand, the second coffee cup on the shelf, which now could go either way depending on who was up first. Yes, she said. He put his hand at the small of her back, and they watched the snow come down on the valley that was theirs, on the ranch that was both of theirs, on the season that would be hard and beautiful and demanding and fine. The winter that had nearly destroyed her had become the foundation of everything. She understood now that this was not irony and it was not luck. It was the basic and unsparing arithmetic of what happens when you survive something. The surviving does not undo the damage, but the damage becomes part of the structure. You build on top of it, not around it. You carry it forward into the new thing, changed by it, but not consumed. She had been broken open by a bad year and a worse marriage and a November morning on a wooden platform in the center of a town that had decided she was finished. She was not finished. She was, for the first time in a very long time, thoroughly and difficultly and imperfectly at the beginning of something. The snow fell. The valley held it. She stood on her porch in her own life and breathed the cold air and knew exactly where she was.